To order, I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chairman is authorized to declare recess at any time. As chairman of this committee, I'm committed to bringing common sense election integrity measures to the floor. Today we have an opportunity to strengthen Americans' confidence in our elections and to encourage participation. I want to thank the ranking member and his team for working with us to move measures through this committee. Over the past year, we've held 10 hearings and 2 public roundtables with 45 witnesses on the issues of voter confidence. Last week, we examined the influence private funding has on our elections. Zuckerbucks, a shorthand term for private funding of elections administration, has distorted Americans' confidence in our elections. In response to last week's hearing, we'll consider legislation that removes preferential tax treatment for organizations that are providing this funding to state and local offices. This legislation will also prohibit the acceptance of private funding for elections administration in the nation's capital, where Congress has power per Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of our Constitution to exercise legislation in all cases whatsoever over the district. Outside of D.C., states across the country have stepped up to prevent undue influence from private funding in our elections. Today, we can move one step further by passing the End Zuckerbucks Act of 2024. Earlier this week, I spoke with local election officials who are gearing up for the next election. Secure elections require proper administration. Election workers are an integral part of the process. They ensure our elections are administered fairly, transparently, and without bias. Next, we'll also consider legislation that allows states to give a hiring preference to veterans and Americans with disabilities who are willing to serve as poll workers. I thank Mike Garcia of California for sponsoring this legislation, which is a component of the bill of the American Confidence in Elections Act. Veterans have served our nation with distinction and commitment, and many are focused on continuing to serve our country. We want to recognize the important public service given by those Americans with disabilities. We must find ways to encourage more Americans to become poll workers, as our elections wouldn't run smoothly without local and state election officials stepping up to serve their communities. I look forward to seeing Mr. Garcia's common sense bill passed today to support our veterans and Americans with disabilities. Lastly, we'll consider legislation to increase transparency in our elections. Since 2000, Congress has worked to require the FEC to make electronic filing mandatory for most political committees and other persons. However, these electronic filing requirements have not yet been expanded to cover electioneering communication reports. The bill we will consider today makes electronic filing mandatory for entities reporting more than $50,000 in electioneering communications in a calendar year. The bill increases transparency and accountability in our elections. Each of the bills considered today will increase confidence in our elections and promote transparency. I look forward to seeing these pass committee. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes for the purpose of offering an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, to you and to the members and staff who have worked with our team on the 3 bills in front of us. Pending the outcome of amendments that I may offer, I may support this legislation. All of the bills are related to the committee's elections jurisdictions, and elections sit at the very heart, indeed are the very heart of this country and our democracy. The franchise is a fundamental political right because it is the preservation of all rights. So many of the core rights that define us, the way we express ourselves, where and how we pray, if we do, who we build our lives with, when and how, and whether we have children, all of those are guarded by the ballot box. And so as members of the Committee on House Administration, we must be guardians of that ballot box. We must be custodians of the right to vote so generations to come will hold these same rights and freedoms that we cherish. So it is incumbent upon us, not only as elected members of Congress, but as members of this committee, to do whatever we can to protect and preserve the right of every eligible American to participate without undue restrictions in the open and transparent elections that shape our national conversation. So I'll have more to say on the bills as they're called up for consideration individually, and I look forward to considering them and considering whether they do their part to strengthen our democracy and to protect our fundamental rights. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, the opening statements of all other members will be included in the record. As required by House rules, a substantive copy of the measures to be considered today have been made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. I now call up H.R. 4486, Hiring Preference for Veterans and Americans with Disabilities Act, sponsored by Congressman Mike Garcia of California, and a component of the American Confidence in Elections Act. This bill clarifies that with respect to hiring election workers, a state or local jurisdiction may give preference to veterans or individuals with disabilities. I'll now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Loudermilk to speak on the bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to lend my support for H.R. 4486. This bill will expand the existing preferential hiring treatment for veterans and Americans with disabilities to include election positions. As a veteran myself, I believe this is not only important to provide support to our veterans, many who come back from combat zones, from hazardous duty, and they're looking for gainful employment. A lot of times, veterans find, especially those that may be in more infantry-oriented positions in the military, which are extremely important to the safety and security of our nation, there aren't quite so many private sector jobs available for someone who is a professional infantryman. And so being able to get a position in such an important role is very important to our veterans. But beyond that, as a veteran myself, one thing that veterans are taught is attention to detail. And details matter very much. My experience in the military, there were rules, regulations, standard operating procedures, guidelines, checklists to guide us in a lot of the critical duties that we would have to do. And the reason that there was so much critical information is because details matter and also integrity matters when it comes to defending our freedom. Poll workers play an important role in the election process, and they help to promote free and fair elections. That's why it's important to have people that understand that details matter, that rules matter, that integrity matters, that law matters, and being able to make a decision not upon your just personal preference, but by what the law requires and what the regulations require. And veterans have served our great nation with distinction and commitment. And as I said, their training and discipline and dedication make them an ideal choice for these roles. And so with those things in mind, Mr. Chairman, and also including Americans with disabilities in this hiring preference, we acknowledge that the contributions they can bring to our electoral process is invaluable. And so with this, I would like to urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, if you'd like to give a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me one second. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I'll reserve until it's appropriate to
Very
offer
good.
an amendment. Thank
The
you.
clerk will please report the bill.
H.R. 4486 to clarify that the state or local.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Also, without objection, the bill may be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment in the
Without
nature of-
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as original text for the purpose of further amendment. Do any members seek to be recognized? Mr. Morelli, for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I jumped the gun. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will please distribute and report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentlewoman from Oklahoma reserves a point of order. Okay. Do you want to be recognized to speak on this? I know Sewell does.
Oh,
It should come to you first. We can come to you
yeah,
first.
yeah, sure. That's great, thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
Mr. Morelli is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is vitally important that Congress does everything it can to ensure that people with disabilities are able to freely exercise their right to vote. But far too many people with disabilities continue to face significant barriers to the ballot box. An estimated 30 million eligible voters in the United States have disabilities, but according to a 2022 Election Assistance Commission report, 1 in 5 voters with disabilities either needed assistance or had difficulty voting in 2022. I think all members of the committee would find this unacceptable. According to the same report, people with disabilities have a 20% likelihood of having difficulties voting in person, compared with just 6% for folks without disabilities. And the problem is nationwide. Last year, the United States Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Los Angeles County, alleging that the county discriminated against voters with disabilities by failing to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. According to the Department of Justice, one voter that relied on a wheelchair had difficulty casting her ballot during the August 2019 special election at a senior facility in Chatsworth, California, a town now represented by the bill's sponsor, Congressman Garcia. House Democrats have long sought to make voting access easier for voters with disabilities, including through the Freedom to Vote Act, which was opposed by members of this of the House Republican majority. The amendment would add a sense of Congress to the bill, simply clarifying that Congress has a duty to fully fund accessibility at voting locations to ensure that every American, regardless of whether they have disabilities, is able to access and cast a ballot. And I urge my colleagues to support voters with disabilities by supporting the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. In general, the sense of Congress as proposed by my colleague I'm supportive of is we look at Section 5. I am supportive in theory. I think there's some details we would want to work out about how we would work through making sure that those funds are available. And so if the gentleman is interested in a friendly amendment of striking Section 5 at this time, I would be willing to be supportive of the amendment. If you'd like to insist, that's fine as well. We can vote on it in that manner. I do think it's worthy to explore this issue. I think it just would take us some additional time to make sure we dig through the details of what that funding structure would look like to make sure that our polling locations are accessible, which I think we broadly all share and understand is a true goal. I just want to make sure as we look at that funding structure that we get it right. And so I would, if the gentleman is interested in that friendly amendment, I'd be supportive. If not, something we should definitely review and consider down the road. I'm happy to yield to the gentleman.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the willingness to work together. I feel like removing Section 5 would undermine our efforts to find adequate funding, but so I'd prefer to leave it in. I recognize that may lose support here, but I also would welcome the opportunity to continue to talk about this issue moving forward.
All right.
And with that, I'll yield back.
This gentleman yields back, reclaim my time. I appreciate that. I think it's something we should continue to work on. I'm going to recommend a vote against this amendment at this time, but something that I'm fully supportive of continuing the dialogue to look for ways that we can make sure all of our polling locations are accessible to every American. I yield back. Is there further amendment? Is there further debate on the amendment? Ms. Sewell is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad that we're discussing this legislation today because I'd like to revisit our conversation on the ACE Act about making voting easier for our men and women in uniform. In 2020, only 2/3 of the military members were registered to vote compared to 83% of civilian voters. I want to offer a straightforward amendment that would streamline resources for service members by providing them with all of the key details that they need to know about the voting process, whether they're at home or abroad. However, in lieu of offering an amendment, I wanted to ask the chairman if he would be willing to have a follow-up conversation with me about this issue. I believe that we should be able to find a bipartisan solution that will ensure that all servicemen and women have access to every possible avenue that can help them cast their ballots. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? Seeing none, does the gentlewoman from Oklahoma insist on her point of order?
No, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
If no, the question is on the is on the amendment by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. In the amendment, the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And the amendment is not agreed to.
May I ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chair?
A roll call vote is requested, and the clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Steil?
No.
Chairman Steil votes no. Mr. Loudermilk?
No.
Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Griffith? No. Mr. Griffith votes no. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Weiss? No. Mrs. Weiss votes no. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes no. Mr. D'Esposito? No. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Ms. Lee? Mr. Morelli?
Yes.
Mr. Morelli votes aye. Mrs. Sewell?
Aye.
Mrs. Sewell votes aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer?
Aye.
Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mrs. Torres?
George Whiteside, California.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, the noes are 6 and the ayes are 3.
The amendment is not agreed to. Do any other members seek recognition? If not, for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I would just ask to seek unanimous consent that the following be added to the record. First is a June 2023 article from the Courthouse News Service, Fed Sue LA County over disenfranchised disabled voters, and the second is the Election Assistance Commission and Rutgers University Joint Report, Disability and Voting Accessibility in the 2022 elections.
Without objection. Does any other member seek recognition? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 4486 as amended, reported favorably to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ayes have it, and the motion to report is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I now call up H.R. 7319, the End Zuckerbucks Act of 2024. The bill is sponsored by Representative Claudia Tenney of New York and co-sponsored by Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma. Zuckerbucks are the private funding of our elections and is election interference, plain and simple. Last week, we heard testimony explaining the outsized influence Zuckerbucks has played in our recent elections. The American Confidence in Elections Act, which passed out of our committee last summer, ended this tax-exempt status for 501c3 or groups like the Center for Tech and Civil Life that seek to influence our elections through private money. The bill combines Representative Tenney's and Zuckerbucks Act of 2023 with Mr. Cole's provisions to prohibit Zuckerbucks applied to the District of Columbia. As 27 states have now banned Zuckerbucks, Congress needs to take steps where the Constitution allows to ensure our elections are free from private influence. I'll now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Bice to speak on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we learned at last week's Zuckerbucks hearing, in the run-up to the 2020 election, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife gave $350 million to the left-wing organization, the Center for Tech and Civil Life. CTCL then, in turn, contributed millions of dollars in the guise of COVID pandemic preparedness to swing states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, among others, to drive up Democrat turnout and help Joe Biden become president. Rep. Sewell even said last week, all of us can agree that no private funding should be funding our elections. The private funding of election administration is bad policy. It does not ensure confidence in our elections. And to be quite frank, if a right-wing group, like the Koch brothers, for example, were providing these funds instead of CTCL, the Democrats on the other side would be rightly outraged. Last week's Zuckerbucks hearing also taught us that banning Zuckerbucks is bipartisan. 27 states have prohibited Zuckerbucks, including Pennsylvania, where its Democrat governor signed the ban into law. Kansas, Kentucky, and North Carolina became law without the governor's signature. In 2020, CTCL gave my home state of Oklahoma roughly $2.5 million. In response to trying to take over the elections in Oklahoma, the legislature acted swiftly in banning Zuckerbucks. Federal law prohibits tax-exempt status for groups like CTCL that provide private funding to election offices across the country. It makes no sense that this legislation rightly removes that tax break. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentlewoman yields back. The clerk will please report the bill.
HR 7319.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Also without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a
Without
substitute.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as original text for the purpose of further amendment. Does any member wish to seek recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will please distribute and report the amendment.
Add at the end of the following, Secretary of Federal Payments to State and Local Governments.
Further reading and amendment is dispensed with. What purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves a point of order. Mr. Morelli is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. We had, as you indicated, a hearing on this topic last week during which I expressed my views on the bill, and frankly, nothing I heard in the testimony from witnesses gives me pause about charitable foundations offering support for election officials. But I won't use more of the committee's time by repeating the other things that I said last week, except to note that the newest version of this bill would once again violate the principles of home rule for the residents of the District of Columbia, which House Democrats have long supported. I also think this is a good opportunity for us to truly put our money where our mouths are. Election administrators have told us time and time again in hearings that we've had that they need additional funding to run safe and secure elections. Last week, we heard from one of our witnesses, Professor Zachary Moore, about the significant costs of conducting elections in the United States. In his FY 2024 budget, President Biden called on Congress to appropriate $5 billion over the course of a decade to support election administrators across the United States. This amendment would authorize that vital appropriation to this bill because if this committee plans on barring election administrators from receiving much-needed supplemental support from nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations, the least we can do is ensure they have the resources they need to run safe, free, and fair elections. It would also require the Election Assistance Commission to speak to a bipartisan group of state and local election administrators and submit a report to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget to ensure that the voices and views of local officials are heard in the budgeting process. Without this amendment, all this committee is doing is cutting election administrators' legs out from under them, leaving them high and dry as we rapidly approach a nationwide and critical presidential election. I urge my colleagues to support election administrators by supporting this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I appreciate the gentleman's concern on funding for elections. I think it is something worthy of our conversation. We've done some work at this committee as it relates to improving the grant-making process at the EAC. And I think there's some real opportunities to continue down that work regarding transparency. I think the broader funding request in this amendment is somewhat not germane, but for purposes of this and maintaining our kind of collegial markup here, I'm not going to make that on a parliamentary procedure, but I am going to recommend a vote against this because I don't think it really hits to the core of what we're trying to do, which is really address the fact that the private funding in our elections causes a reduction in people's confidence in their elections. I think we have a real opportunity to find that bipartisan support to remove that. So I'm willing to continue working and dialoguing on ways that we can improve the grant-making process through the EAC. I think it's important to make sure that our elections are properly funded. I think it's heavily dependent on state and local funding. We could have that debate elsewhere. I'm going to be recommending a no vote on the amendment as offered, but I do appreciate the gentleman's concern to make sure that there is funding for our elections. I yield back. Is there further debate on the amendment? The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would agree in part and disagree in part with the chairman. I agree that this is probably not the right time and place for this, but we need to have a discussion. And my concern about the money, and the money always concerns me, but my concern about the money is that we don't have anything in there that creates a level playing field or maybe addresses some of the problems, which is why I kind of like the study language, because we heard from actually the Democrat witness last week that you have to be careful because you want to make sure that the rural areas are probably getting a little more help because they need different help than they might need in the more urban areas. And so I think the study's a great idea, but I think before the study, it's premature to figure out whether or not we should be spending the money and how much we should be spending. And I think we probably need to build in a formula to make sure that there's not a disparity between the various different types of populations. When I say that, I'm not talking about the demographics of the people. I'm talking about the geography of the land. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment?
I move
What
to strike
purpose?
the last word on
The
the
gentleman is
underlined.
recognized for 5 minutes.
As the ranking member of the Election Subcommittee and the sponsor of the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I care deeply about our responsibility to ensure our elections are secure and accessible. However, elections cannot be secure or accessible if they're not properly funded. It saddens me that this committee has chosen to pursue legislation that will suppress get-out-the-vote efforts instead of focusing on properly funding our elections and expanding access to the ballot box. For far too long, election administrators have been turning rotten lemons into lemonade with inadequate resources. The consequences of inadequate resources is long lines, polling station changes without notification, ballot shortages. Far too often, these consequences disproportionately impact minority communities. It is time that we address the funding gap by pursuing robust public funding to ensure that election workers have what they need to equitably run elections, protect election workers, and safeguard our democracy. When Republicans decide to join Democrats in adequately funding safe and accessible elections for all Americans, it will be open to considering proposals to eliminate private funding. However, I can't help but notice that the House Republicans' FY24 budget zeroes out funding for election security grants in FY24 budget during a presidential election year. Congress cannot step in to provide assistance every once in a while. We have a responsibility to equitably fund elections every election cycle. Today's bill, I believe, is a distraction from the real issues facing voters, from fake robocalls funded by conservative operatives like Elon Musk spreading election disinformation and misinformation on his platform. Right-wing interests seem hell-bent on keeping Americans from the ballot box. I will be voting no on the underlining legislation, yes on the amendment, and I ask unanimous consent from the chairman to put into the record this article entitled "How a Biden AI Robocall in New Hampshire Allegedly Links Back to a Texas Strip Mall."
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, since last week's hearing, new evidence has emerged about recent fake AI-generated robocalls urging New Hampshire voters not to vote for President Biden in the primary. It turns out that the funding stream behind these robocalls are linked to the same billionaire I talked about last week who funded Miss Molly Hemingway's organization, the Federalists. You may recall that Miss Hemingway was one of the witnesses in last week's hearing for the majority. During last week's hearing, I made note of the connection between Ms. Hemingway's employer, who paid for the January 6th rally that led to the violent insurrection. It just so happens that Richard Uihlein is also the largest funder of the Life Corporation, the company responsible for the fake AI-generated robocalls to New Hampshire last month. I point this out not only as hypocrisy, but to note that we should really be worried about equitably funding every election, not just sometime. I can't really understand why the majority would totally zero out election integrity grants for the 2024 presidential election. Nothing is more important than ensuring that all Americans have access to quality to the ballot box and can vote for the candidate that they choose, free of any sort of AI-generated robocalls and other deceptions. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time, but I hope that we can work together on trying to figure out ways that we can actually adequately fund elections through public funding. Thanks.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? Does the gentlewoman from Oklahoma insist on her point of order?
No, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
If no, the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
May I ask for a recorded vote?
A roll call vote is requested, and the clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Steil?
No.
Chairman Steil votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? No. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Griffith? No. Mr. Griffith votes no. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? No. Mrs. Bice votes no. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes no. Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Ms. Lee? Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Sewell? Yes. Mr. Morelli votes yes. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mrs. Torres? Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 6 noes and 3 ayes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Do any other members seek recognition? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
May I ask for a recorded roll call?
A roll call vote is requested. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Steil?
Aye.
Chairman Steil votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes aye. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mrs. Bice votes aye. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee? Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes no. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer votes no. Mrs. Torres?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will please report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 6 ayes and 3 noes.
The amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 7319 as amended, reported favorably to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to report is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider. A recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Steil?
Aye.
Chairman Steil votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mrs. Bice votes aye. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee? Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Sewell? No. Ms. Sewell votes no. Mr. Kilmer? No. Mr. Kilmer votes no. Mrs. Torres?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 6 and the noes are 3.
The order to report favorably to the House has been agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now call up H.R. 7321, the Electronic Filing of Electioneering Communication Reports Act, sponsored by Mr. Morelli of New York. The ranking member and I co-sponsor this legislation. The bill amends the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 to modernize certain reporting requirements for electioneering communications. The FEC, the Federal Election the Federal Election Commission, enforces federal campaign finance laws that require entities to file electioneering communication reports. However, while federal law requires almost all reports filed with the FEC to be done electronically, the electioneering communication report must be filed on paper in most cases. Unfortunately, paper filings are subject to delay due to post office processing or disruptions in the delivery of mail. Electronic filings are not. This legislation requires most electioneering reports to be filed electronically. This promotes transparency. The FEC can publicly post. This promotes transparency as the FEC can publicly post these reports as soon as practical, rather than having to wait to receive the report in the mail. This legislative change has been a top priority of the nonpartisan legislative recommendations from the FEC in 2021, 2022, and 2023. In addition to bipartisan support, we have worked with our Senate partners in crafting this language. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes to speak on the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a meaningful bipartisan act to ensure that the public receives important information about election-relevant communications. I'm happy to introduce it with my friend and partner, the chair, Mr. Steil, and I hope it can move rapidly to the floor and then to the President's desk for signature. As the Federal Election Commission has informed Congress, compared to data from paper records or paper reports, data from electronically filed reports is received, processed, and disseminated more easily and efficiently, resulting in better use of resources. Reports that are filed electronically are normally available to the public and may be downloaded within minutes. I agree. In contrast, paper filings take days to be available to provide critical information to the public. The Supreme Court has long recognized that disclosure requirements are vitally important to provide the electorate with information, quote, as to where political campaign money comes from and how it is spent, unquote. American voters are best equipped to choose our leaders when they have the most fulsome, most up-to-date information at hand, and this bill will aid every American voter as they exercise their fundamental rights. So again, thank you, Mr. Chair, for your cooperation and help of staff and the members. I fully support this bill and hope will ensure passage. Thank you, and I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The clerk will please report the bill.
HR 7321.
Without objection, the reading of the bill is dispensed with, and without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Do any members wish to seek recognition? Ms. Sewell's, for what purposes does the gentlewoman seek
I
recognition?
move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to just echo the sentiments of Mr. Morelli that this is a common sense bipartisan bill. Look forward to voting for it. I think it's really important that we provide timely disclosures of communications, election communications to all persons. I think this goes to the heart of election integrity, and I fully support this bill and look forward to voting for it. Thanks.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further, does any other member seek recognition? If not, the question now occurs on ordering HR 7321 as amended, reported favorably. Not as amended, because we didn't amend it. If not, the question now occurs on ordering HR 7321 reported favorably to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to report is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. This concludes the order of business for today's markup pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L. I ask that committee members have the right to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, minority, and dissenting views on each of the items marked up today. Without objection, also, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes. If there's no further business, I thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the Committee on House Administration stands adjourned.